Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. Welcome to our special Indoctrinate You, the Progressive Agenda. Today we're going to talk about the danger of woke progressive ideology in your kids' school, particularly K through 12, and the problem that this is creating for the future of our country. And then, of course, in your own kids' hearts and minds and souls. I want to go way back. I read an amazing article by Mir Soloveichich, Lincoln's Almost Chosen People. And this story chronicles Lincoln's trip across the country from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C. after he was elected president. So he gave this speech. He wouldn't mean to, but he wasn't intended to. But he was on the back of the train in Springfield, and the train was taking off. And he said, "I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of the divine being, whoever attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail." So he leaves Springfield, and then he goes to Trenton, New Jersey. Right? This is very close to where Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas Eve to attack the unsuspecting British, the turning point in the Revolution. Lincoln grew up reading about that story. So he gave a speech in Trenton, right down the street. And he said, "I remember all the accounts there given of the battlefields and the struggle for the liberties of the country. And none fixed themselves upon my imagination so deeply as the struggle here at Trenton, New Jersey. I recollect thinking then, boy even though I was, that there must have been something more than common that those men struggled for. That something even more than national independence. That something that held out a great promise to all the people of the world to all time to come. And I shall be most happy indeed if I shall be the humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty, and of this, his almost chosen people, for perpetuating the object of that great struggle." That quote right there and that whole speech, it's all about history and the connection between different people throughout our history and the history of humankind and common cause and mission and purpose and God. He spoke of Trenton as sacred soil. Now, there's one more Lincoln quote I want to share, but let me just cut to the chase here. This is a pivot point in my whole thinking of America. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, he made his first visit to America. He was a young student, and he went to D.C. on a Greyhound bus. And he arrived in the morning, and he spent the whole day on the mall in D.C. looking at the monuments, Lincoln, Jefferson, and the rest. And he realized, he said, what fascinated me was that each of these monuments, that I'm sure we've all been to before, I haven't been to in long enough though, each of these monuments come with its own texts. The Lincoln Memorial had the Gettysburg Address on one side, and on the other, the Second Inaugural. And so with the others. I suddenly realized that American memorials are not just to be seen, but also to be read. He said it's the exact opposite in London. If you go to Parliament Square in London, you'll see a memorial to David Lloyd George, and it has just 3 words: David, Lloyd, and George. That's it. You go to the monument to Benjamin Disraeli, and there's 2 words: Benjamin and Disraeli. You go to the monument to Winston Churchill, he just gets 1. Churchill. Why the difference? And here's the key. Other places, other people have a tradition society. We live in a covenant society. In a tradition society, things are there just because they're there. And they've always been there, and that's just sort of the area that it is, and that's it. But United States is a rare phenomenon. We are a covenant society. We're going to talk much more about this at the end of the show with Inez Stepman. I hope we can get to this, about how multicultural we are. And because we're multicultural, it is essential, more essential here than in other places, that we understand where we came from and why we exist. Because we are a covenant society. A covenant society represents conscious new beginnings, founded on an idea and a proposition. When we lose sight of that covenant, of what it was. And then even worse, in our K through 12 curriculum today, we attack that covenant. We denigrate the covenant. We demean the people who first made it, our founding fathers. It's over. The covenant's gone. And then we're not one united people, then we're just... Lincoln's final stop was in D.C., before D.C., I should say, was in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. He said this. So think about this. Oh, this is such a beautiful imagery. So think, he goes from Springfield, his like little tiny town, to Trenton, where Washington crossed the river, and then goes to Independence Hall, Philadelphia, the beginning of it all. And here he is, Abraham Lincoln. Amazing. He says, all my political warfare has been in favor of the teachings coming forth from this sacred hall. May my right hand forget its cunning and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I ever prove false to those teachings. That's Psalm 137. That's how brilliant these men were and how ingrained in scripture they were as well, that he could just quote from Psalm 137, and he didn't need to say, I'm reminded in Psalm 137 that it's just beautifully ingrained and intertwined with it. What was the teaching, by the way? The teaching was that all men are created equal. By the way, before I go on, the president of the San Francisco school board the other day was asked by a reporter from the New Yorker, of all places, can you tell me one good thing about Abraham Lincoln? Because they removed Abraham Lincoln, among others, from the name of their schools. And can you name me one good thing about Abraham Lincoln? And she couldn't. She said, no, I can't. There's nothing good. She said he killed indigenous people. Okay? That's who we're up against here. They can't see the beauty and the majesty and the importance of what men like Lincoln and, of course, our founding fathers did for where we are today. Anyway, I have often inquired of myself what great principle or idea it was, right? The idea that kept this confederacy so long together. It's not the mere matter of the separation of the colonies from the motherland, but that sentiment, covenant, in the Declaration of Independence, which gave liberty, not alone to the people of this country, but I hope to the world for all future time. This all then culminates in the Gettysburg Address, where we rededicate ourselves to the proposition, right? That was the power of it. We rededicate ourselves to the proposition that all men are created equal. A new birth of freedom, sanctified by the sacramental blood of the soldiers who died in that battle and the Civil War in general. Contracts end when people die. Covenants last generations under God. That's the difference. They last for generations if our kids are taught. This is why the progressive woke ideology in our schools are so dangerous, because it doesn't just ignore this covenant, it destroys it. The intent of the progressive agenda is to destroy the covenant and the people who first made it. Do you trust people like the head of the San Francisco school board with your children? And not even with your children, with truly understanding the importance of this covenant, when they can't even name one good thing about Abraham Lincoln? I'm telling you, it won't stop on its own. Right? This progressive movement, and it's certainly infiltrating our schools and marching through the institutions, it doesn't just peter out on its own. It must be stopped. And that's why I'm glad you're here right now. Coming up, we're going to talk about the details of the ethnic studies curriculum. But in the next segment here, I want to talk big picture. What is critical race theory? What is, right? It's a big word, big term. Kind of meaningless when it's critical race theory. It doesn't sound bad. It is. What is it? Talk about that next. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Indoctrinate You, the Progressives Agenda. I want to go to one of our good friends, Mike Gonzalez. He is the author of the book, The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free. Mr. Gonzalez, how are you, sir?
How are you, Mike? Happy to be on
Really
with you
good.
again.
Thank you, sir. Let's start here. What is critical race theory? We've heard this idea out there, but I want every single one of our viewers to be able to define it within just a few sentences so they can spread the word and tell their school boards, etc., why this is a giant problem. What is it?
Well, it's really an issue, a concept that I think your listeners should get very, very well acquainted with, because it has entered the schools, not just the children's schools, but all universities. Basically, what it is a program to dismantle Western, especially American society in our case, through criticism. You tear down all the institutions. You tear down the family. You tear down the schools. You tear down history, tradition, through intense criticism, and then you replace all these institutions with something new. Obviously, critical race theory does this by looking at everything through the prism of race. Critical theory is an earlier concept, started in the 30s. Was the same thing, but didn't just look at everything through race. In America, because we're obsessed with race, we use race to look at everything. This has really entered our classrooms. It is being taught in elementary schools, in middle schools, in high schools, and in colleges. And one important notion that I don't want to leave out is that it analyzes all of life as being divided between categories, but not just categories of oppressors and categories of the oppressed. And it looks at history as something that the oppressors have written, and that needs to be replaced with a counter narrative from the oppressed classes, from the marginalized classes. That's just a very rough definition. We can get into it later if you want.
No, that's great. No, it's great. So what's tricky about all these things is there's always a kernel of truth to this, right? So like it's the kernel is it's good to question things. It's good to question history and interpretations and our founding. It's good to question these things. So where do they take it too far? This idea of criticism.
Well, you make a very good point here. First, we need critical thinking. We need to analyze things critically. When the 55 delegates were meeting in the Philadelphia Convention, they were saying, well, at one point they were saying, well, slavery is something that's going to go away very fast. There was a general feeling in 1787, and actually throughout the whole revolutionary period, that there was going to be a contagion of liberty. You can take a look at that debate and say, well, they actually, the founders felt this way, and then things later on, which we can get into, didn't happen that way. You can just say, actually, this was used as an excuse by some not to deal with slavery squarely. So you can actually have this debate, but that is not what critical theory does. That's not critical. Critical theory is rather the opposite of critical thinking. Critical theory says, no, you must criticize the founders. What they did was to try to preserve slavery. They were slave owners, and so it actually takes away any attempt at weighing both sides and having a good-natured, political, agenda-free debate. Another thing that you bring up with your question, go ahead. You wanted to say something.
No, I was going to say, I'm trying to think of the posture between the two things that you just articulated, the difference between critical thinking and critical theory. Critical thinking, it's the way you described it, it's very like open. It's like, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? Well, that's interesting. I never heard that. Blah, blah, blah. Critical theory sounds very, no, this must be taken down. This must be destroyed. What are the different postures that people have? Is that fair?
Yeah, that is exactly right. It hides a project to take down American society. It is the enemy. All critical theorists, critical race theorists, are opponents of capitalism, and they say that. It's not just me saying that. They write that. All of the main, if you look at Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw or Richard Delgado or Gene Stefancic, this is now critical race theory. They all think that capitalism is racist, it must be replaced, and it must be replaced not with a softer form of capitalism, but with more central planning, with the government making decisions to give more to certain groups, members of the categories of the oppressed, and take away from the oppressors, and actually make sure that the categories of the oppressors don't even have rights such as freedom of speech. This is why you have cancel culture today. So it is a very straitjacketed way of looking at life, which excludes critical thinking. We should have critical thinking, just not critical theory.
Yeah. So as opposed, so you kind of answered this already, but I just want to make this very clear for me and everyone. As opposed to what? Because if you go to a school board, so a parent goes to a school board and says, I'm against this critical theory, and explains it as articulately as you did. The people will say, okay, well, what would you rather do? And then he'll say, well, I want to teach history this way. You're like, oh, well, you're just teaching the victor's side. You're just teaching the white man's side. You're just teaching the homophobic side. You're right. So what's the ideal way to teach history / approach all scholarship?
Well, actually, the essay in 1937 that establishes critical theory was called Traditional Theory versus Critical Theory. And it actually said that traditional theory was too dependent on facts, on absolute truths, on things that were immutable. So we have a parent going back and saying, look, we have to teach what happened. There are facts, historical facts, and nonpartisan. Men did meet in Philadelphia in 1787 for many days, actually. Things were said. We have very clear records, some of which were taken down by James Madison, of what was said. We can debate this, just like I suggested before. You can debate how something was used by some or others, but things did happen. In fact, I would tell you, Mike, that we should teach more African American history in the sense that Frederick Douglass is not taught enough. Booker T. Washington is not taught enough. If you ask the average American senior in what century Frederick Douglass was born, you would probably get all sorts of answers. Nobody knows anything about Marcus Garvey, and they have a very skewed understanding even of Malcolm X or MLK. So I think that we should teach all that. By the same token, the men who met in Philadelphia in '87 were men of English ancestry. There were very few Irish there. Also, there were no Italians. There were very few Scots. Most of them, they're 3 generations before their ancestors had immigrated from England and settled North America. That is a fact that we must contend with as well.
Let me give you another kernel of truth. A lot of this is based off of, or it's framed as, and a lot of people are tricked with, it's just kindness and it's compassion and it's equality and it's being nice, especially the younger grades. That's what it's all framed as. Like we talked the other day about how Black History Month has been turned into Black Lives Matter Month. And last week at LA and San Diego school districts, it was Black Lives Matter at School Action Week. And last Wednesday was Queer and Trans Affirming Day in the school districts for all grades, right? But when you look at the younger grades, it's very happy, right? It sounds all very nice and kind and whatever. How do we fight against that and not be accused of being mean?
Well, because we're not mean and we can speak with our heart. I have sifted through Black Lives Matter at School, the curriculum, and it is just awful. I mean, it really does. It is all about transgenderism. It is all about queer affirming. These are their terms. It even has mathematics through social justice. It has social justice mathematics. So it teaches mathematics by trying to figure out what are the chances that police will stop African Americans in Los Angeles. Even that has a political agenda. We don't need a political agenda to teach our children. This curriculum is something that parents should be really arguing strenuously with the educators about and say, look, you're not even teaching our children anymore because you won't come to school. So now what you're doing is you're teaching something that is a political project in order to change America. That's the reason I named my book, The Plot to Change America. We just need facts. The children need to be taught facts, and then we can debate these facts agenda-free, good-naturedly, as the left and the right coming together and coming to a rough consensus on what happened.
I'm obviously so with you, but it's so hard, so difficult to do that because in our country today, everything's relative. There's no such thing as truth. Everything's relative. Who are you to say? That's just your perspective. We've been teaching this one-sided perspective for so long. Now it's time that these other voices have a say, and all this. That's all the rhetoric against us, and it's quite a hill to climb. Let me jump over, if I can, Mike, to your article in the New York Post about equity, and what Joe Biden did when it comes to equity. With his executive order. How does the left define equity?
So this is actually, it's part and parcel of the same thing you and I have been talking about. What the Biden administration is doing, and actually they take a page from the critical race theory proponents, such as Ibram X. Kendi, is that equity, we have a corrupted meaning of equity. It is no longer what it used to mean. It is no longer all Americans are protected, are afforded equal protection under the law. It is, no, we're going to treat Americans unequally depending on which category of the oppressed they belong to. So, for example, this will end up in the absurdity that a wealthy American neurosurgeon of Chilean origin is a member of a marginalized category in need of greater resources that are paid for by the taxes of a Pensacola waitress whose father was a white sharecropper. That is obviously absurd. It makes no sense to anyone. This is not to deny a history of problems that have occurred, but what this equity push by the Biden administration produces is a nation of castes. It's not America in the 21st century. It's India in the 17th century, where you're born into a caste, and evidence of success cannot liberate you from that social marginalization that you're born with and can never shake off, even through a successful life.
Oh, I got 30 seconds, but expand that more, because I hear a lot of, like in churches even, they'll say, here's the history of black oppression in America. And they leave it there in order to justify what you just talked about here. So why does what you just said turn us into, or the history of black America and how terrible and blah, 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 why does that turn us into a nation of castes?
Well, in my book, I don't have a chapter for black Americans because black Americans are unique. Black Americans are they did suffer immensely, and we're still trying to sift through that with this past. They were, we know that, the history. But what happened is when these other categories were created in the 1970s, all the activists analogized falsely the suffering of all the members of these other categories to the suffering of African Americans, which was again absurd. No other group suffered from legal segregation to the degree that it did from legal discrimination. No other group was lynched to the same degree. So African Americans are a unique category. The problem is this analogizing of the experience of others to African Americans, which was done on purpose.
Yeah, that's interesting, to hitch their wagon to the oppression train that we see today. Mike Gonzalez, The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free. I'm sure we'll talk again, sir, and get more detail. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Coming up next, Katie Grimes to talk about details, specifics. California, I think it's next year, is going to require an ethnic studies course in order to graduate, and ethnic studies curriculum is horrific. We'll give details next. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Indoctrinate You, the Progressive Agenda. So the first segment, we just talked to Mike Gonzalez about big picture. What is critical race theory? What is critical theory compared to critical thinking? They're two opposite things. Right now, I want to get into more details, more specifics of what is an ethnic studies curriculum, because obviously it's going to be pitched as something wonderful and fantastic, and we're learning about other cultures, and that's not what it is. Katie Grimes is here. She is the editor of the California Globe and the co-author of California's War Against Donald Trump, and I've known Katie for a long time, and she's one of the finest actual true journalists in this ridiculous state. Katie, how are you?
I'm well, Mike. How are you?
Good. I'm grateful you're here. Talk about this ethnic studies curriculum. If I have it right, I think it's next year every high school graduate in California has to take an ethnic studies class.
Yes, and this is actually based in a bill that Governor Jerry Brown signed in 2016, kind of dictating that the California public education system would be requiring ethnic studies for every graduating student.
Okay, what's in these courses?
It's a re-education is what it is. It's all based in Marxism, and it is about convincing today's students that our U.S. Constitution was racist, that white people have dominated for too long, and now it is time to flip it so that minority opinions are what is more important in America today. It's unbelievable, actually, some of the stuff that they've proposed and actually been caught proposing. They removed it from the curriculum and then snuck it back in. So it's educational, it's racial justice, it affects international worldviews, memories, experiences, identities, gender, all the crazy stuff we're hearing today is all wrapped into this ethnic studies curriculum.
Yeah. Does anyone listening now trust the people who wrote that curriculum and who will present this curriculum at all with your children's minds and souls?
No, and parents are going nuts. The ones that have found out about it are going absolutely nuts. That this stuff.
I didn't interrupt. I'm sorry. I remember a couple years ago when this first came out, I think we did a whole 3-hour radio show, just walking through it. And there was enough outrage, if I remember correctly, that they stopped it or they took it down. And I think they decided to be more covert about it now, as you mentioned. What was some of the outrage early on? Wasn't there something with like Jews were upset or something because it didn't include the Holocaust or whatever? Do you remember any of this controversy?
Yes, exactly. And that's a big part of it. It's extremely anti-Semitic and teaches students that Islamophobia is wrong. So what happened was in 2019, the California Department of Education released kind of one of their first drafts of their proposed ethnic studies. Gibberish is what it was, frankly. And it included a huge section on Islamophobia. And fortunately, the California legislature's Jewish caucus really had a problem with it and made a big statement. And so the Department of Education removed the offensive language and really just put it in as footnotes. But very quickly, it was entered right back into the curriculum. And it's still there.
And of course, with no context that anti-Semitic hate crimes far exceed Islamophobic hate crimes in America. What's that been, the anti-Semitic angle of all this? Where's that come from?
Well, you know that there's this huge BDS movement, this boycott, divest movement of everything Israel going on in our country. And it was very, very strong during the Obama administration. And unfortunately, several, or probably more than several now, of the California university system's colleges have adopted this. Their student governments are voting on it and agreeing to, support the boycott, divest movement of Israel. And consequently, you've got a lot of Jewish students in our public university system quite nervous and feeling like they've got targets on their backs because this is such a hateful process. And, we've seen it in our CalPERS system, CalSTRS, they've all tried to divest themselves of Israeli investments. So it's really throughout our government, and now it's in our curriculum.
If I remember, SodaStream is an Israeli company. I remember Harvard got rid of SodaStream out of their dining halls because you can't have anything to do with Israel, which is absurd. I know, Katie, you've been following San Francisco Unified and just the disaster that is renaming the schools and all that. I saw an interview in the New Yorker the other day, and the reporter asked the president of the school board, tell me something good about Abraham Lincoln. And she couldn't. She's like, well, he really mistreated the indigenous people. So I don't know, that's about it. That's appalling. So what does ethnic studies curriculum teach about the greats of American history?
That they were racists, that they were slave owners, that they oppressed Native Americans, that they oppressed Black people, that they oppressed brown people, that the only reason they ever wanted migrants in the country was to enslave them. I mean, this is the insanity. They're erasing George Washington's name off of public schools, along with Abraham Lincoln's. And one of the proposals was to replace it with Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead.
No way.
Way.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
No way.
I thought naming us Jerry Garcia High would be quite appropriate.
Whoa. What was bad, so it's just to prove everyone how rabid these people are, they took down, in San Francisco, they took down Dianne Feinstein's name. Dianne Feinstein is too far to the right.
Exactly.
For the San Francisco, and these are like, it's one thing to mock the San Francisco School Board, but correct me if I'm wrong, Katie, these are the type of people who are writing this, and then someone may be watching this now and think, well, I'm not in California, thank goodness. No. It's coming to you, right? This is country, and I see stories like out of Austin and all these other, like to Texas, school boards across the country picking this up, right?
You're absolutely right. It is everywhere, and these people have very deliberately and quietly infiltrated departments of education in various states. The San Francisco School Board president, by the way, is a 30-year-old. A 30-year-old who majored in feminist studies.
Are you serious? Wow, what? I didn't know that.
And she only
so she's a product of this.
Yeah.
Say that again, sorry?
Oh, she only taught 4 years in the classroom, and guess what she taught? Spanish immersion. This is what's directing our Board of Education in a city that used to have a great education system.
Amazing. So what is a parent to do, Katie? What does a parent do?
Well, we've seen a huge group of parents in the Santa Barbara area, oddly enough, have a lot of success fighting back at their school district curriculum. And that curriculum was really sexualized. It was so disgusting. There's things in it that we can't even say on the radio or TV. And they got together and they hired lawyers. Unfortunately, it took that, but they hired lawyers and they've been fighting their school district now for about a year and a half. And it's working. I mean, it exposed what was going on. And what was going on in this curriculum was repulsing people. And as I said, if you can't say it on the radio or TV, it shouldn't be taught to kids in the classroom. And it was being this kind of stuff, and I mean very sexualized stuff, very questionable things that would make you and I blush, was being taught to kindergartners.
You thought on top of that, the other day we talked about how Black History Month has turned into Black Lives Matter Month. And the other day was Black Lives Matter in School Action Week. And Wednesday of that week was Trans Affirming and Queer Affirming Day. And they're celebrating Black trans activists. And I'm sure that's in the curriculum too, right?
I'm sure it is, actually. When you get back to some of the statewide curriculum on the ethnic studies stuff, it's also got all that weird gender neutrality things where the letter X is now taking place of instead of her and she. I don't get it. I think I'm too old to get it, but it's in the curriculum.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah, they do the Z, like ZHE sometimes too. Wow. Yeah. Wow, it's insane.
Curriculum.
And private schools are no better sometimes.
Well, here's the problem, and this is where some education scholars have explained that even if you homeschool your kid or you have charter schools or private schools, the universities all require the same graduating material to be able to get into public universities. And some of the private universities have become so radicalized, they want all this garbage as well. So, even if you think you're saving your homeschooled kid from all this stuff, to be able to go on to university, somewhere they still are going to be tested on it.
Yeah, and obviously if you're at home, you can frame it properly, but definitely watch out for private schools even where you think you're safe, but in many cases, they can be worst of all. Katie Grimes, you're the best. CaliforniaGlobe.com. Please check out her website there, where she's the editor, and read the book, California's War Against Donald Trump. Katie, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mike.
Have a wonderful day. Coming up, Inez Stepman from the Independent Women's Forum, and we'll talk bigger picture about why, we'll talk about the unions and what this will do moving forward to America if we continue down this path. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Indoctrinate You, progressivism in schools, wokeism, the progressive agenda, wokeism in schools, and it has infiltrated every single part of it. It's brutal. Stop sending your kids to these places. Inez Stepman is here. She's a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. Inez, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
Good, good. I'm grateful you're here. Let's start with just wokeism in schools. What have you seen that is most troubling in this regard?
Well, I mean, there's so much to choose from, but I think I really want to go back to the 1619 Project and the furor over that. And at that time, I kept saying, you know, this is a capstone. This is not a new narrative in the public schools. The idea that America's irredeemably evil, that her founding is not a declaration of freedom and equality, but is rather a false or worse, contains within it the seeds of future and perpetual inequality and racism. That narrative is not new in the public schools. It has been going on for decades, just in less splashy ways than, you know, the New York Times or the BLM curriculum that's now being shopped, critical race theory, Ibram Kendi, right? What's really changed is that the mainstream has focused a light on this. And I think crediting Donald Trump here is important. Donald Trump was basically the first Republican in the limelight to say, wait a minute, this is an important issue. This is an important cultural issue. What we teach our children about their relationship to their country is there aren't a lot of issues, I will say, that should be higher on the priorities list politically for people who consider themselves against whatever wokeism is doing to this country. There aren't any higher issues on the priorities list in terms of like political issues or what we should be horse trading for politically than this issue, how we teach children what it is to be an American.
All right, let's dive deeper into that then. Why does it matter? Because if you today in our critical theory where you have to destroy everything, including nationalism and patriotism. These are all bad things. Nationalism, patriotism, jingoism. It implies xenophobia. What will happen if we continue down this path? What's the end result? And then I'll ask you what the alternative should be.
So first of all, we can talk about the results that have already happened. We now have two generations in America, mine, the millennials, and then the folks coming up after us, the Zoomers, Gen Z, that have radically different views of America and know radically less about the American system and American history than the generations that came before them, right? And we see this in just about every poll. We see that majorities to even numbers like upwards of 2/3 believe that America is a racist country. Something like 40% of people under the age of 40 believe that America is one of the most unequal societies on the planet, which is just insane and factually obviously wrong. And at the same time, and I think not disconnectedly, we see that the same two generations know very, very little about the specifics of American history or American government. So only 1 in 5 people under the age of 45 can pass that basic citizenship exam that we give to naturalizing American citizens. And that's stuff like, you know, how many years is the senator's term? You know, what are the 3 branches of the federal government? I mean, it's really, really basic stuff. And literally only 20% of people under 45 can pass that. And that's because the school system isn't teaching any actual concrete civics. It isn't teaching the context into which America was born, what its trajectory has been since it came into the world in 1776, by the way, not 1619. And these are really important things, I think, to answer your question about where we're going. These things are critical, particularly for a nation like the United States, because we don't have essentially this history as an ethnic tribe. It's actually the exact opposite, I think, of the way that, for example, Nicole Hannon-Jones or some of these folks paint it, which is to say 1776 is actually the glue that has united people from all around the world. America doesn't have an ethnic tribe. It never had an ethnic tribe. And here I'm not just talking about enslaved Africans who were brought here against their will. but also, people of different parts of the British Isles, people from Germany, people from Ireland, Scotch-Irish, right? These were not considered the same people at the founding of the United States. And so we are a nation that actually has a date of a founding, not just the date that began the republic, but the date that the entire country found. And that's important. Like, this is the only thing that really binds us together at the end of the day, is this kind of civic religion built around 1776. And if we get rid of that, I really fear that this country will splinter, that it, will not be exempt from the forces of history, the forces of tribal warfare or of splintering into like different geographic groups. Like, that is what has held us together. And if we lose that, and it's been under attack from the left, and I know this isn't a long answer, but I do think it's important, like, it's been under attack from the left for, at least 50 years, probably longer. And that's dangerous, particularly, I think, in this country versus a country like France or, I don't know, whatever.
Australia would be like the most obvious one.
Australia is actually kind of a counterexample, right? Because they anyway, but a lot of the countries in Europe, right, like Italy, France, Germany, they have a different and sort of longer organic history than the United States. The United States is very intentional. We have an intentional founding. We have, a sort of civic religion with a creed that at some very high level of abstractness, we had 80, 90% buy-in on. And I fear that if we drop too much lower on that buy-in, the forces pulling us apart are going to be stronger than the forces pulling us together.
Yeah, that's perfect. The idea, and I think you're right, you're so right. Everyone needs to understand that America is an idea. Is that fair? Talk me through this. America is more of an idea than an ethnic heritage or something. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, and in a way that isn't just about sort of jingoism, right? Because you could say something like, I do think France is the perfect counterpoint, right? France has an ethnic core. It was originally built around a tribe. They've allowed substantial immigration, right? They haven't done a great job with deciding what the immigration level should be and then what kind of assimilatory procedure should be in place. But they've allowed immigration like most modern countries, but they have this sort of core tribal history that goes back. And for that reason, we talk about republics, right, in France, or we talk about, eras of different regimes of government. It's not at all clear to me, for example, that if tomorrow Americans voted to dissolve the Constitution, that this would still be the United States of America. So it's not that there obviously is the influence of a particular people, but I don't think that particular people is ethnically chosen. And it hasn't been going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, some people dispute this historically. I tend to think that the historical evidence is pretty clear that we were a multi-ethnic nation from the beginning. We were an ethnically tolerant nation, relatively speaking, from the beginning. And I say that with full knowledge of the evil exception of slavery. But if you look at sort of bringing different peoples into the country, this has always been multi-ethnic. It's always been a hodgepodge. It's always had the ability to absorb different peoples. I think the only real comparison in history to the actual strength, people say this is a joke, but the actual strength of being able to do that has given us is the Roman Empire. And so this country is unique in that way, that we have a founding date, that we have these kind of creedal documents that pass to return to schooling for a minute, that was the purpose of the public education system. It might not be immediately obvious why America, especially at the founding, where so many things were not done by the government, why from very early on we actually did have public schools. We had publicly funded schooling. It didn't look like it does today. We had publicly funded schooling. It was exactly because of this, because the founders realized, especially Thomas Jefferson, who was a big spearhead and advocate for universal education, because he realized we have to perpetuate these ideas that hold us together. Like, we have to train the next generation in both the burdens, the responsibilities, but also like the philosophy and ideas that are necessary to perpetuating this American Republic. And that is actually why we have a public school system. And today we spend over $700 billion every year, which is among the highest spenders per pupil of all of the developed nations. So it is a lie that we do not spend money on education. We do. We spend over $700 billion every year. And I would argue our education system is doing the exact opposite of what it was founded to do. It is un-Americanizing children, whether their parents came here recently or their parents came here, 10 generations ago. It is un-Americanizing us. It's teaching us to hate our country and to have a hostile relationship with the country. And I think America, of all places, cannot endure with this.
Wow, so good, Ines. It'd be one thing if, I think I'm a millennial, I guess. I'm 35 or 6. My schooling I went to like a good public school, and it was just like meh. Like I didn't learn anything, right? Like that's bad enough. But now, as you said, we're actively teaching the opposite, which is way worse than my situation. And I think parents need to realize that, because like you're not just sending your kid to a meh school. You're sending your kid to a school that is actively teaching your kids to hate this country and these important ideals that unite us. That's so good. And it'd be one thing, to go back to something you said earlier, if kids were learning more, if they knew, like these civic tests, if they knew more about our country than ever before and then concluded to hate it, then we could like talk about that. But they know nothing about our country and our founding and hate it. And that's the worst couplet. So what do we do, Ines? What is each individual parent? What's your suggestion to each parent? What should they do?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that parents can do, but first and foremost, in order to empower parents to do those things, we have to change how we fund the system. And I think the last year or so or 11 months or however long the schools have been closed, it has really shown in sharp relief that we have to change the incentives in the system, because what we've seen is that parents' voices are very easily ignored. And that's because nobody's salary depends on their satisfaction, right? Like this is a really basic concept. If parents and families don't have any influence over the bottom line and everybody in the school system gets paid regardless of whether kids get educated at all at this point, and certainly whether parents are happy with the education that they're receiving, it's going to be extremely difficult to change the system. There have been attempts to change sort of civic curriculum and stuff like that, but the most recent round of them being in the sort of Tea Party era, 2009, 2010, 2011, there were a lot of bills passed in the states, for example, that kids would have to pass the citizenship exam, things like that. Those have largely been a failure. And I think it's because you cannot really mandate, like you can write a set of standards that says, third graders must learn about George Washington, but you can't micromanage every teacher in the state who then teaches that George Washington, what the kids should learn about George Washington is that he was a slave owner, and that's the beginning and end of his contributions to the country and the world. So I think largely those kinds of top-down solutions have been a failure. And I think the only option that we have now is to hope that there are enough families who are shocked by these things. And I think there are hopeful signs on that score, right? I think the other big aspect of having school on Zoom in people's living rooms is that they've realized exactly what you said earlier, like the transition from sort of meh or something they might have found reasonable or at worst sort of deficient, but not actively hostile to their values. There's definitely been a transition in the last 5-10 years towards a more active teaching of America as just a bad force in world history. And an oppressive, evil country. And I think a lot of parents have seen some of these things, like they've seen the critical race theory classes, they've seen their 10-year-olds on Zoom having to sort of renounce their white privilege and admit that they're oppressing their classmates who might be of a different ethnic background, right? I don't think that the majority of American parents want their children to learn this. And so that's the peg that I hang my hat on. I think it's really, really critical. I think we have a huge opportunity in this specific legislative session in the states to pass broad-based school choice. And it's critical to me that I think that it be broad-based, that it not just be targeted at folks who are on the very lowest part of the income spectrum. That's generally where school choice programs have been targeted. And that's a lifeline, and that's fantastic. It's a lifeline out of what are often the schools that are serving their students and their families the worst. So I don't oppose it by any means. But I do think that it's important actually to give a lot of middle-class families this kind of power, because there are a lot of families who are not, at the poverty line, but nevertheless don't have the money to send, 3 kids to private school. or don't have the ability to homeschool. There's plenty of people now who are realizing that actually some of their kids, not all, but some of their kids might be better served at home, learning at home, and participating in sort of social activities in a different way. But there are a lot of things. I think we can just target it at people who are at the lowest end of the income spectrum. I think that broad-based school choice here has to be the answer, and it'll remain the answer as long as Americans, a majority of American parents, don't fully buy into this, and I don't think they do.
I think that's so wise. Inez Stepman, follow on Twitter. Where else can people find you, Inez?
You can find my work at iwf.org, along with the work of my wonderful colleagues.
Of course, Independent Women's Forum. Thanks, Inez. You're wonderful. Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks.
Have a wonderful day. I beg of every parent to consider all their school options, charter schools, even private schools. Don't let money stop you from inquiring and asking about scholarships and doing what it takes. And don't be afraid to take whatever lifestyle steps you need to take to lift up your kids' education. Behind their spiritual health, there's nothing more important than that. So if that requires living in a smaller house and moving in a trailer, you do it. It's that bad in the public schools. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word.